Hey everybody, this is Baker's Backyard again. Hope you're doing well. We are actually about at the end of our early study of the American presidency in our early republic. We will end our conversation today with a discussion on the presidency of James Monroe, right, and many of the after effects that his administration has with some of the previous things that we've looked at. Like, for example, how do we still see the presence political power at the federal level kind of being supported by the Supreme Court in this case? And how do we also see the after effects of the Louisiana Territory being added with new states wanting to, of course, become a part of the Union and have representation? And what kind of things have to happen? How do we also deal with other matters regarding the issue of land, territorial expansion, and you could argue America's expanded role in affairs in our part of the world, which is the Western Hemisphere, or New World, as some people call it. So we have three big objectives we want to focus our attention on and master for today that we'll kind of discuss and add a little bit of detail to. And we're going to analyze the primary source that's probably the most well-known with President Monroe, and that is his famous Monroe Doctrine. So let's go ahead and get started. So we want to be able to explain using examples, a few of them. How does the John Marshall Court and key U.S. Supreme Court cases support federal power? Okay, so if you think about that, guys, think back to our first week and even part of our second week of study when we looked at this emergence of political parties and what party was the one that is going to be the most supportive of federal power. Federalists. Okay, and so his court, you know, we talked a little bit about the Marbury versus Madison case with our second week of content, guys. What we notice is that we are continuing to see a court that is very much favoring decisions that support or signify, if you will, the power of the executive, the federal level. The question is, how do they do it, and in what kinds of issues, which are going to be a little bit different. Okay. Secondly, we want to explain the consequences of territorial expansion on the slavery debate and how compromise was used to address the controversy. We're going to look at one of the more essential American political figures of this time period that never became president, ran several times, but was very much admired by many people, including Abraham Lincoln later on, for holding the Union intact in these crises, if you will. And that, of course, is the famous Henry Clay. All right. And then thirdly, probably the most important thing, or shall we say the most well-known thing that most people think of with Monroe is going to be the famous Monroe Doctrine. All right. Which we'll look at that here toward the end of our discussion. Okay. So the question I have for you all is an image, because a lot of people, they've heard of Monroe. Maybe they don't know as much about him as like somebody like Washington or somebody like John Adams or even Jefferson and Madison. But he's got a good resume to be president. So what is this? It's a picture. It's a painting. It's a famous painting, of course, crossing the Delaware. And almost always we're like, okay, well, Washington stands out. Monroe is right there. Okay? And so this guy has a role with our revolution. He has a role with the early development of the presidency in different ways. He has a role with states. He is a very well-known, respected in a lot of ways, and also a very influential man, even before the things that happen while he is in office. Okay? And so what you notice, guys, is that he's going to have a pretty solid background. You don't have to worry about writing down every single one of these details, but just a little bit of his resume. Look at it. Governor of Virginia. He held 2 cabinet positions in the administration of his predecessor, James Madison. That's pretty impressive when you look at somebody who's giving you advice on not just foreign policy, but also, of course, the idea of warfare and conflict. Okay? We see a transition to a different party system. Okay. And then last but not least, for sure, as the era of good feelings would suggest, there's debate about, is it accurate to completely call it this era of good feelings? that's something for y'all to maybe do a little bit more research and all that. But, not everything goes well during his time in office, but the country is seeing progress, right? We're seeing economic progress. We're seeing the development of what we call internal improvements. That'll be what we talk about next week, at least partly, with the first industrial revolution and trying to expand American trade and things like that. Okay, we see cultural development that we'll look at the following week with new literary things, an American dictionary, and all these different writings are starting to take kind of like an amount of attention to America has talent, right? Like that show that we see on TV, but we're showing the world that, there's something unique about the United States, or actually many things unique. And then as Americans, we need to be proud. And of course, people that are like, okay, we have a pretty solid nation that's developing. Okay. So just one quick thing, this is a little bit of a setback. That's about 2 years into his first of 2 terms, keep in mind, is we have what many historians consider to be the first major depression in American history. Okay. Now, I know a lot of us guys, when we think of the Great Depression that starts in 1929, we think of a lot of things. You got to remember, people, guys, have not had a Great Depression like the one that you and I think of first. So this is kind of going to be their major depression, but the conditions are going to be a little bit different. Okay. And so what you notice is that it's like, okay, well, you've got setbacks in the economy, you've got setbacks with different things along the lines of land purchases and all these different things that stand out. But for the most part, the one thing I would say is that this depression is considered to be, in my mind anyway, kind of a minor hiccup, if you will, compared to some of the other things that tend to take more shape under Monroe's presidency. When you start to look at the Supreme Court ruling more about defining federal power a bit more in depth, and the slavery debate that pops up with the eventual new states entering and trying to keep that balance that we'll look at in a moment. And then of course the idea of new states that we don't already have as territories, like Florida and things like that. Those are all things, guys, to keep in mind. Okay, so something to consider. But the big picture here is, guys, is that how does the Supreme Court start to assume more, you could say, authority with making decisions and certainly defining the power of the federal government? Okay, now think back to what we've learned prior to now. This is not a new issue. This debate about federal government power, you have it during the Whiskey Rebellion, which is in the 1790s. You have it during debates over whether we should ratify our Constitution. Does our new Constitution at the time give too much energy to a federal government? Well, the reality is, guys, the Constitution was ratified. Whether people liked the process, whether they didn't, that's obviously debate for later. But the way to use this Constitution and basically what powers are defined with it, that is very much open to, of course, interpretation. Well, the Supreme Court, as the judicial branch, right, they have the power and authority, if you will, to interpret these laws and these policies. We've already seen that confirmed with the famous Marbury versus Madison case, which, by the way, also goes back to an earlier case that came out of the John Marshall Court. Okay, so what do we notice? That even though the Federalist Party, guys, in form is going to be kind of phasing its way out, the idea of federal power that the Federalists really supported, that is not going to basically be going away. Okay, so it's going to adjust, right? The idea, the principles are there. However, the party by name is going to change. Okay, and so you see 2 court cases in front of you: McCulloch versus Maryland. Okay, and also the famous Gibbons versus Ogden case. Now you can pause your screen for a moment and take a look at the basic nuts and bolts of these cases. But 2 overarching questions pop up one from one case, one from the other. But the big one that's not on the screen, guys, that you all really want to think about is how do both of these court cases confirm the power of the federal government when it comes to defining the meaning of the Constitution? Okay, so if you take a look at McCulloch versus Maryland, it actually goes back to something that we're all familiar with, the Bank of the United States. Okay, now the Bank of the United States is a federal institution. Okay, it's been formed in the 1790s. You're going to see obviously controversy pop up again with, of course, President Jackson in the late 1820s and early 1930s. But at the end of the day, Maryland as a state is basically trying to tax this federal institution. That's the basic nuts and bolts of the reason why the court case happens. Okay, so think about what's the big picture. You've got a state that certainly has powers by the 10th Amendment, reserve powers, but the question is, do they have the right and authority to actually tax a federal institution? Okay, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to consider with their eventual ruling on this case. Okay, and think about what we've already laid the groundwork with, guys. All these court cases really do, as far as the big picture, is confirming the constitutionality of federal power. So who do you think they sided with? It's not going to be the state of Maryland. It's going to be obviously the federal government. Okay, so their ruling pretty much, guys, in a nutshell is that the state of Maryland and states in general do not have the authority to tax this federal institution. Ergo, you could say states' rights supporters are like rats. So, man, then what happens with Gibbons versus Ogden? This is a court case that actually had to do with the use of the most reliable and significant form of travel and trade purposes, the river. Okay. And this came about with a big debate about, who has the right to regulate trade in the rivers. Now, guys, as a lot of you know, rivers border different states. The Ohio River borders Ohio and Kentucky, amongst others. Okay. Same thing when you're looking at some rivers in the Northeast and other parts of the country. Okay. The question is, okay, do these states have the power to say that you can use this river a certain way? Or on the other hand, no, you can't. Well, that's the debate here. Okay. Now, according to Article 1, Section A of the Constitution, which defines the powers of our Congress, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to use to make a decision about what they think in this regard. Okay. And for the most part, Congress does have the right to regulate interstate commerce. All right. Commerce between the states. Now, what they can't do is they do not have the power to put what would be called taxes on exports. All right. So they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to say, well, if you're exporting a good from, let's say, Kentucky to another state like Ohio, you know what, we're going to have a tax on that. They can, in fact, tax imports, as we've seen with the revenue taxes of tariffs with Hamilton, and then also in our previous lesson with Madison, where we have our first protective tariff. Okay, so who do you think the court is going to side with? And you're like, Mr. Baker, that sounds like a broken record. Well, it's not really designed to be, but the answer is federal power. Okay, now the one thing I want to bring to your attention, guys, is that not every single court down the line is in fact going to have the exact same tune, and they're also not going to have the exact same Chief Justice, which, keep this in mind, every Chief Justice has the same number of votes as every other person on the U.S. Supreme Court, which today that would be 1 out of 9. Okay, but in many cases, Supreme Courts are very much defined by the personalities and the presence of their Chief Justice. Okay, so we're going to see that down the line. We're going to see that with Roger Taney with the Dred Scott case in the 1850s. We're going to see that with even in the 1950s moving forward with Earl Warren's court that defines a lot of things from civil rights for African Americans, to even rights of the accused, if you've ever heard of like the Miranda rights and Miranda versus Arizona, but that's a ways down the line. Okay, so we're seeing that during the era of good feelings, there's a lot of attention brought to defining further federal power. And then the question is, guys, what about all this land that we got from Louisiana? All this land that you see that we eventually associate with pretty much what you see with eventually the Missouri territory. Okay. Well, the answer is it's massive. There's a lot of land. It's already been, of course, explored by Lewis and Clark. Okay. So we already know it's got some value to it. You know, you've got people that are already starting to move out to places like the Oregon Territory. You know, this is still going to be Mexican territory for the time being until about, 1848, with eventually the Mexican War, even the annexation of Texas that happens before. So why do I bring that up? We bring it up because you've got a lot of territory that is basically now being settled. And guys, think about it. If you're living in this territory, you know, you might say, well, okay, we have the U.S. government to give us military protection. But at the end of the day, if you want your people and citizens to have real voices, what do you want to be able to do? You want to be able to vote and have representation. That's going to be why about 1819-ish or 1820, you're going to have new states that are basically saying, let's enter the Union. Now, let's face the facts. Missouri and also eventually Maine are not going to be the first new states of the Union after the original 13. How do we know that? Well, we've already seen Tennessee. We've already seen Kentucky. Those are both going to be slave states, as you can see. We've already seen Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Okay, but what are they trying to maintain? A balance of power with slave states and free states. Okay, in regards to how they're going to be represented. Now, the thing to keep in mind for those of you that maybe haven't taken civics, which is fine, is remember that we've got two branches of Congress, and one of them is the House of Representatives, which is based off of population. So you are not guaranteed as a state, even if you're the size of Texas, which is absolutely humongous eventually, all right, you are not guaranteed that you're going to have the same number of House reps as a state like Virginia, right, or a state like Pennsylvania that has considerably more population for the time being. That will change as, of course, our country develops, okay? And so why is that important for us to keep in mind? Well, there is, one part of Congress that is based off of equal representation, and that's going to be the Senate. Okay. The Senate has a lot of power. They have the power to block voting on things through, what's called filibustering. They have the ability to approve treaties. They have the ability to declare war, amongst a few things. In other words, guys, maintaining a balance there is seen as absolutely vital for the interests of both free states and slave states. Okay, well, what happens? Missouri wants to become a state. They want to become a slave state, right? There's people that are obviously moving in there. They're bringing slaves with them. Now, this is not going to be the first issue that happens. Of course, down the line, you'll see more. And so it's like, okay, well, we're going to have an imbalance. So this is why, guys, get this detail down, that eventually we'll look at the importance of Henry Clay in a second. But anyway, so if the goal here is to maintain a favorable, I'm sorry, not a favorable, but a balance of slave states and free states, you're going to have to do exactly that. You're going to have to add one and add another one. Okay. And so Missouri, as you can see, becomes a slave state. And Maine, which actually was a part of Massachusetts, originally anyway, is going to be a free state. Okay, so we've kind of dodged a bullet there. Now, I would say, most historians, guys, would agree with this, that this is kind of a Band-Aid. This is going to have long-term consequences. I'll give you an example. Even somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who we know was a slave owner and lived in Virginia, he's still alive, keep in mind, until the year 1826. Jefferson does not see this compromise as a really good result. Okay. And he writes continuously to a lot of people about it. Okay. And so why would we do that? Well, part of it is to keep the Union together. And part of it is it shows leadership on the part of Henry Clay. Okay. So this is where Henry Clay continues to make a really big name for himself. He's still going to be alive by the early 1850s. Okay. So, you're going to see him pop up again. He's known as the Great Compromiser. Compromise is a very important thing, guys, as a lot of you know, to keep a country or a society or even a group of people somewhat together, right? And therefore, what happens is that he's going to be very committed to the idea of union, all right? Union meaning country, right? Because Henry Clay understands, as did Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, Abraham Lincoln was a big admirer of Henry Clay, guys. But Henry Clay understood the idea that if you want to keep the country together, then you're going to have to compromise on this issue. Now, I'm not condoning slavery by any means, but his argument is that union is the number one thing, and therefore the Constitution and union go hand in hand. Okay, even though he owned slave himself, he was from Kentucky, which was a slave state. And so the point is, guys, is that he is going to really get heavily involved in this compromise. All right, now you're going to see him become kind of like a big enemy, you could say, or definitely adversary of even somebody like Andrew Jackson. In fact, Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 1830s is going to have a lot of real big problems with Henry Clay for a variety of different reasons. All right, partly of it is personal, not as much this. Okay, but anyway, but you want to keep Henry Clay, guys, in the back of your minds, or maybe even the fronts of your minds, because he is going to play a big role with this eventual compromise. Now, I want to show you the map again and show you another piece of the puzzle with this compromise that is going to pop up later, and that is, take a look at the line here, this 36°30 line. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, this is not really that big of a deal. Well, it is. And my question, guys, for all of you is to pause your screen and ask yourself the question, why would this line be so important? Well, think about what you see. Okay, so you've got Missouri as a slave state. Oregon is a territory, not a state yet. We'll look at that a little bit later. And what do we notice? You eventually have Arkansas, but they're going to have to be open to be a free state. Florida is eventually going to enter the Union as a slave state, right? Even though you see clearly here it's labeled as free, okay? And all this territory here. Now, if you take a look here, guys, you'll notice the Michigan territory, Missouri territory, etc. Okay, those territories have not even, I mean, Michigan's a little bit of an exception here, guys, but you'll notice that Missouri, above Missouri, has not formally, kind of separated and defined its boundaries. So why is that a big deal? Well, if you take a look at the greenish here, guys, the Missouri Compromise also states, and this might be worth noting, by the way, that slavery cannot exist above that line. Now, you might be wondering, well, why Oregon is still in the red? Well, the reason is because America does not have full, complete ownership of it quite yet. Oh, really? Who? Great question. There's 4 countries that have actually been kind of divided on it. Russia, Spain, who eventually will sign a treaty with, so Spain will kind of sign their rights over to an extent, and Britain, and also the United States. By the time the 1840s roll around, ladies and gentlemen, Britain still is holding on to their commitment to Oregon. And we'll see how that unfolds. It almost led to a war, fortunately for us. We have a president by the name of James K. Polk, who was like, okay, probably a war is a bad idea here. So we agreed to kind of like a compromise or a treaty. Okay, why is this such a big deal? Well, guys, put yourself in the shoes of Southern slaveholders. The government of the United States is also influenced by representatives from those slaveholding states. Okay, So what do we notice? Well, anywhere that's below this line is eventually going to be pressured to actually enter as a slave state. That includes Arkansas eventually. That includes the eventual territory, country, then state of Texas. That includes all this Mexican territory that we gained control over as a result of the war. It also includes, you can't see this, but if you go further south here, even guys, there was an attempt in the 1840s unsuccessfully to even purchase Cuba. We actually call that the Ostend Manifesto. That's not something you have to worry about writing down. And there was even a push by a guy by the name of William Walker, okay, to actually further expand American territory south into parts of Central America. Okay, so a lot of these people are like, well, okay, we compromised. Guess what we're going to do next? If we can't expand northward with slavery, then what we're going to do is we're going to try to find other ways of doing that. Okay, so anyway, that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective there. Okay, so it wasn't popular by everybody. Jefferson was a big critic, but for the time being, it does hold the Union somewhat more together. All right, so Abraham Lincoln is going to say, Clay, you did a nice job, okay, with Union being your primary reason for this compromise. Okay, so how do we expand beyond that? Well, guys, remember we just talked about Florida. One thing for us to keep in mind, yes, a lot of us, we love going to Disney World. We love going down to Florida for summer weather. It's kind of hot there this time of year. But who owns it? Before, obviously, Walt Disney was like, cool, Orlando, money. The Spanish does. Okay. And the deal with this is, guys, it's not on the slide, but a little bit of background is that you have a lot of land that's owned by Spain in the New World, which is starting to become more independent. We'll look at that more in a second. But they're not really governing it, okay, from across the pond in Europe, right? So in other words, they're not really managing their land. And so you've got, if those of you that are familiar with the Seminole Native Americans that are in this area of Florida, okay, and other parts of Florida as well, they're basically going into parts of Georgia, right, and Alabama and places like that. So they're basically, there's conflict there. Monroe, by the way, makes a decision to send Andrew Jackson down there, all right, the famous hero of New Orleans. And Jackson, as a lot of you know, is not really one of those people that's, the easiest guy to direct with your orders. And so what happens is that Andrew Jackson kind of takes it upon himself to, I guess you could say in a way, kind of start some conflict. And so we have a series of Seminole Wars. Okay. The British even get involved in this conflict. I think it was that Andrew Jackson hung a couple of British people. Not exactly a good idea when you're trying to not go to war against a country that probably, as we saw with the War of 1812, has the potential. They probably could have defeated us if they wanted to, but they decided not to, right? You could argue. Okay. Why is that a big deal? The argument is, Spain, if you're not going to control your land, we're going to. Ergo, America buys Spain. Buys Florida from Spain. Okay. And so we signed this Adams-Onis Treaty with a dash mark above the I there, guys. And who's the architect of this to a large degree? It's going to be one of the unsung heroes that we'll come back to here in just a moment with the famous Monroe Doctrine. But he's the Secretary of State under Monroe. Okay. And of course, the son of John Adams, president number 2. Okay. So John Adams steps in here and he says, we want Florida. We're going to pay you for it. You don't have to worry about the amount of money. Okay. Millions of dollars. And the Spanish agree. In addition to, guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice that Spain says we're kind of bowing out with that claim, if you will, to the Oregon territory or country. Okay, so guys, if you look here really quick, it says now that this territory is claimed, which means it's disputed, really. Okay, but it's claimed by the US, it's claimed by Britain, and it's also claimed by Russia. Russia eventually says, nah. And so we have this ongoing dispute until it's settled in the 1840s. Okay? And then last but not least, the Monroe Doctrine. Now, guys, think about what you know about the word doctrine, if anything. You have a lot of doctrines in American history. You have Monroe's Doctrine. You have something that's similar with the Roosevelt Corollary of the early 1900s. You have the Truman Doctrine during, the Cold War, Eisenhower, Reagan, Nixon. The list goes on and on. Okay, so essentially, what does a doctrine do? It's kind of like an official statement that defines an official position, in this case, of the president. Okay, and so what I want us to do, guys, is talk about, okay, first of all, what is the doctrine? Well, let's take a look at our next really important slide here, and we're almost finished, I promise. Okay, and so the Monroe Doctrine is Monroe making a statement. And you might say, well, Mr. Baker, man, that's a short thing. Well, this is actually a part of one of his annual addresses to Congress. He's speaking to Congress, no television, no internet, so no people are actually going to be watching. Of course, they're able to have access to this through papers and things like that later. Okay, so December 2nd, 1823. So this is about 2 years, okay, a little bit more than that, actually, excuse me, into Monroe's second term. Okay, and I want you to think as we read through this together. First of all, what in the world is the guy saying? Secondly, why would he make this kind of a statement? And thirdly, is Monroe really in a position, and is the United States in a position to uphold what he's getting at? Okay, so before we read it, let's take a look at what's going on. Okay, so guys, if you look at the map here, take a look. It says Latin American independence. Latin America is kind of like America's backyard. Okay, why an American concern? Well, guys, check this out. You might even want to pause your screen, pause meaning stop the video and then come back to it. What is the whole point behind what we see here in 1800? Okay, these places are still heavily controlled, colonized by countries from where? Europe. Spain, the Dutch, which you hear a little bit less about in that area, but they still control some areas. The French, which has a very small place there still. They got rid of the Louisiana Territory. Haiti declares independence in the earlier 1800s, etc. And then as you can see here, Portugal. And it's kind of hard to see, guys, with Britain, but that's part of the current country of Belize, which, by the way, does not get independence officially until 1981. So not, much before you all were born, 20 years or so, I guess it was. All right. And then it's kind of hard to see here, but even as you can see, Jamaica. Now, what's the difference? Fast forward the clock, 30 years. Okay, which is about the time, a little bit beyond the doctrine we talked about. But what do we see? One word: independence. Now, those of you that remember world history, talking about Simón Bolívar, okay, etc. He's kind of like the George Washington of South American independence. Okay, which you ever learned about Bolivia? Obviously, a lot of places are named after him, right? So all these places are trying to get independence from Spain and other parts, and a lot of them have. Brazil declares independence from Portugal in 1822, I believe it was, okay, amongst others. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, think about it like this. These European countries are still powerful countries, and what is the concern of the United States and Monroe? They want to still control the New World. Okay, so therefore, he's going to send a message. What message? Check it out. This is part of it, not the whole thing, but it's the one part that most people probably know the most. So look at what he says, guys, and you might even want to pause this, maybe kind of reflect on it as you watch. Look at what Monroe says. He says, we owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations, amicable meaning, hopefully peaceful, ones that are not going to be warlike, existing between the United States and those powers. What powers? European. To declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies and dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments, we have declared their independence. In other words, a sizable piece of those other nations we looked at, we'll come back to that map in a moment, guys, and maintained it. In other words, they've held on to it, okay, and whose independence we have on great consideration and on just principles acknowledged. There's a word we use for that, guys. It's called recognition, okay? We could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. What is he getting at? Well, a couple of things. You could see this, ladies and gentlemen, as a warning. Can we uphold it? Do we have the military strength? Because after all, think about it like this. Essentially, what's the big picture message? You are not welcome. You are not welcome to come back over and colonize the territories that you lost. Translation, no further colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, Mr. Baker, some places still are colonies. The Spanish still control Cuba. They still control, Puerto Rico, which eventually, of course, becomes a United States territory, still is, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let me explain this real quick. We are not telling the Spanish, the British, the French, anyone else who has territory in the New World or this part of the world, Western Hemisphere, we are not telling them that you must give up your colonies that you still control. But think about it like this. Why would he say, okay, you cannot further colonize what you've already lost? Okay. And the concern is, guys, is that, like I said a moment ago, our backyard is what we're trying to protect. Because at the end of the day, you can make an argument that European presence in the New World is seen by many as a threat to American security. I read a book recently where the author made a really interesting argument. Almost about a whole chapter of the book was on this doctrine, and he made me think about this a lot more. So I'm passing it on to you. But the author guy said that because of James Monroe's doctrine, and because of the position that he took with, we might have to go to war against you if you push the envelope. Fortunately, there weren't too many times where we had to basically get serious. Okay. But this author, guys, makes the argument that the Monroe Doctrine basically shows a commitment to American security. And as a result of that, that Monroe should be considered to be really that president that puts that as a primary goal with his doctrine. Now, you all can be the judge on that for yourselves. Is that correct to say that Washington wasn't doing that with neutrality? I would say that Monroe is doing it in a way that would possibly make it to where we would have to use power a bit differently than somebody like Washington or even Adams, Jefferson to an extent. We know that, of course, we fought a war with Madison. Okay, but I'll leave you with that. And my last point, guys, is, in your opinion, has America developed enough to really uphold the principle of that doctrine? Okay. I want to remind my students to please finish your week. Okay. Make sure you've submitted your assignment for Monday or Tuesday if you already haven't. Please make sure for the standard group that you do your, excuse me, your weekly review activity. You can take that as many times as you want to make a 50 out of 50. It's a very good review tool for the quiz that you'll see. Honors, please make sure that you use the content toward the actual concept writing, okay? And then lastly, please remember your quiz and check everything off on your week so you can move on to week 4. Thank you for your time. Have a good one. Hope you all had a good session. And as always, guys, stay safe, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good one. Bye-bye.